Rachel was driving to visit her friend late one night, eager to catch up after a long week at work. She had taken this route countless times, but tonight felt different. A thick fog had rolled in, settling over the road like a heavy blanket. The trees on either side of the highway loomed larger, their shapes distorted in the mist. As she drove, she kept glancing at her GPS, which flickered intermittently. "Come on, don't fail me now," she muttered under her breath, tapping the screen. After a while, Rachel saw a sign that read, "Welcome to Pine Hollow." Confused, she didn't recall this town being on her route. Deciding to take a quick look around, she turned down a narrow road leading into the woods. The trees seemed to close in around her, the fog growing thicker with every passing minute. As she drove deeper, a feeling of unease washed over her. The air felt charged, heavy with a sense of foreboding. Rachel shook her head, trying to dispel the anxious thoughts. "It's just a small detour," she reassured herself, gripping the steering wheel tighter. But the atmosphere grew more oppressive, as if the woods were watching her. Suddenly, the headlights of her car illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. Panic surged through her as she slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt just inches from the figure. It was a woman, her clothes tattered and muddy, her long hair hanging limply around her face. Rachel's heart raced as she tried to comprehend the scene before her. "Are you okay?" Rachel called, her voice shaky. The woman turned slowly, revealing hollow eyes filled with despair. "Help me, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of the wind. Rachel's heart sank. "What happened? Where are you going?" But the woman only pointed toward the woods, her expression pleading. "You have to help me. I can't stay here." Torn between fear and compassion, Rachel decided to get out of the car. She stepped cautiously towards the woman, her instincts screaming at her to run. "What do you need help with?" As she approached, the woman's expression shifted from fear to something darker, a flicker of madness in her eyes. "They're coming for me," she said, her voice trembling. "You have to help me hide." Before Rachel could respond, she heard rustling in the bushes behind the woman. Her instincts kicked in and she stepped back. I think you should get in my car." The woman nodded fervently, her eyes wide with fear. Rachel quickly led her to the passenger side, and they both jumped into the car, locking the doors. As Rachel started the engine, she glanced around, her heart racing. The fog thickened and the shadows in the trees seemed to writhe, closing in around them. "Where are we going?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. "Just drive. Don't look back," the woman urged, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror. For what felt like an eternity, they drove in silence, the tension palpable. Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The air grew colder, and the woman beside her began to tremble. "Are they following us?" Rachel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," the woman replied, her eyes wide with terror. "Just keep going." Suddenly, Rachel spotted headlights in the distance, illuminating the fog. Relief washed over her. "Look, there's a car!" she exclaimed. But as they approached, she realized the car was stopped in the middle of the road. Her heart sank as she recognized the make. It was the same model as the one she had seen earlier. "Stop the car!" the woman screamed, her voice laced with panic. Rachel slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt just inches away from the other vehicle. The woman turned to her, tears streaming down her face. "You have to go back. They're coming." Before Rachel could respond, the fog thickened around them, swallowing the road ahead. She felt a cold breeze wash over her, and the shadows grew darker, pressing against the windows. Then she heard it, a low, chilling laugh echoing through the trees. Panic surged as she turned to look out the window, and what she saw sent ice through her veins. Figures were emerging from the darkness, their faces twisted and grinning. "Drive!" the woman screamed, but Rachel was frozen in place. The figures began to move closer, their shapes shifting in the fog. She could hear their whispers, a cacophony of voices calling out to her. "Help us! Help us!" Finally snapping back to reality, Rachel threw the car into reverse and slammed on the gas. They sped backward, the figures rushing toward them. Just as she turned the wheel to escape, she felt something brush against the side of the car, a hand reaching for her. Rachel screamed and slammed the accelerator. The car lurched forward and she quickly turned to follow the road out of the woods. As they drove away, the woman's screams echoed in her mind. "Keep going. Don't stop." They raced down the road, the figures fading into the mist behind them. Rachel didn't stop until they reached the nearest town, bursting into a gas station, shaking uncontrollably. The attendant stared at them, concern etched on his face. What happened? Rachel could only shake her head, tears streaming down her face. The memory of the woman haunted her, the echo of the whispers still ringing in her ears. She would never forget Pine Hollow, or the darkness that lay within its depths. Jason was driving home after a late night out with friends. The streets were quiet, the moon hanging high in the sky as he navigated through the familiar streets. He felt a little buzzed, but he was sober enough to drive, or so he thought. The sound of his favorite playlist filled the car, keeping him entertained as he cruised along. As he turned onto a darkened road, he felt something shift in the passenger seat. He glanced over, expecting to see his friend who had fallen asleep next to him, but the seat was empty. "Must be tired," Jason muttered to himself, shaking off the unease that crept in. But as he continued driving, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Suddenly, the radio began to glitch, the music cutting in and out. "Hey man, can you fix that?" He heard a voice mumble from the back seat. Confused, Jason looked in the rearview mirror, but the back seat was empty as well. "What the hell?" he muttered, his heart beginning to race. He turned up the volume, but the static grew louder, drowning out the sound of the road. "Stop it," he shouted, but the radio continued to glitch, the noise warping into distorted voices. Just then, he felt a cold breeze wash over him, sending chills down his spine. He glanced at the passenger seat again, and this time, he swore he saw the outline of a figure sitting there, but when he looked again, it was gone. His heart raced as he tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "Is someone there?" he asked, his voice shaking. The outline seemed to shift, and he heard a whisper, faint but clear. "Help me." Panic surged through him, and Jason slammed on the brakes, pulling over to the side of the road. "What is happening?" he gasped, staring at the empty seat. The whispers grew louder, echoing around him. "Help me." "Let me go." Jason's instincts kicked in. He couldn't stay here. He needed to get out. Jumping out of the car, he stumbled into the darkness, desperately trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. "Stop. Please stop," the voice cried, but Jason could see no one. He backed away, heart racing, as the realization hit him. He had been lured into a trap. Just then, his phone buzzed in his pocket. The same unknown number flashed on the screen. With trembling hands, he answered it. "Help me. Please help me," the voice whispered, but now it was coming from inside the car. Jason didn't stick around to find out what lay ahead. He turned and ran, fleeing down the dark road, adrenaline pumping through his veins. He didn't stop until he reached the nearest house, pounding on the door until someone let him in. Shaken and confused, he could still hear the whispers in his mind. "Help me?" Finally, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly man with a worried expression. "What's wrong?" Something, was in my car," Jason stammered, struggling to catch his breath. "Just wait here," the man said, his eyes narrowing as he stepped outside, flashlight in hand. Jason followed him, glancing nervously back at the road. He felt the weight of fear settle heavily on his chest. The man swept the flashlight across the area, illuminating the trees and bushes. "What did you see?" he asked. "I don't know. It was like a shadow, and the voice, it was pleading for help," Jason exclaimed, his heart racing as he remembered the chilling words. The old man nodded slowly, a grim expression crossing his face. "You're not the first to experience this. The woods around here are filled with lost souls." "What do you mean?" Jason asked, feeling his stomach drop. "There are stories of people who wander into the forest and never come back. Some say they can still be heard, crying for help," the man said, his voice low and serious. Jason felt a chill run down his spine as he thought back to the voice he had heard. "Is there anything we can do?" he asked desperately. The man shook his head. "The best thing you can do is leave this place. Get as far away from here as you can." Feeling a wave of relief, Jason quickly returned to his car. The old man stood watch as he started the engine, the sound roaring to life. As he pulled away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The old man stood in the middle of the road, the flashlight beam illuminating the darkness behind him. Jason drove, heart pounding, feeling the weight of the darkness lift as he reached the main road. But as he drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following him, lurking just out of sight. Jessica was driving home after a late shift at the diner, the moon hanging low in the sky, casting a silvery glow over the desolate highway. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the soft hum of her car's engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. She had taken this route countless times, but tonight felt different. An unsettling weight settled in her stomach. As she drove, she noticed a pair of headlights appearing in her rearview mirror. At first, she thought it was just another late-night driver, but as the minutes passed, the car behind her seemed to get closer, almost too close. Jessica's heart raced. She decided to speed up, pressing her foot harder on the gas pedal. But no matter how fast she went, the headlights remained fixed on her bumper, unwavering and relentless. Her mind began to race with possibilities. Was it someone playing a cruel prank? Or worse, was she being followed? She glanced at the speedometer. She was already going 10 over the limit, but the car behind her didn't seem to care. The headlights remained steadfast, a predator stalking its prey. As anxiety bubbled to the surface, Jessica made a sharp turn onto a side road, hoping to lose her pursuer. The gravel crunched beneath her tires, and she felt a moment of relief. But when she looked back, the headlights had followed her, burning bright against the night. Panic surged through her. She turned left, then right, trying to shake the car off her trail. Each turn she took, the car remained just behind her, close enough that she could almost feel the heat of its headlights. "Why won't they just leave me alone?" she whispered to herself, gripping the steering wheel tightly. She made another turn onto a less traveled road, one she remembered being overgrown and winding. As she drove deeper into the dark woods, her heart raced. The trees closed in around her, the darkness becoming thicker, and she was filled with an ominous sense of dread. Suddenly, she spotted a clearing up ahead with a small old house illuminated by the moonlight. It looked abandoned, but desperation urged her to stop. Maybe she could find help, or at least call for assistance. Jessica pulled into the driveway, her breath quickening as she glanced in the rearview mirror. The headlights had stopped, just a few feet away. The other car was parked, its engine running, and the driver remained inside, watching her. She felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Gathering her courage, she opened the door and stepped out, heart pounding in her chest. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. No response. The driver's side remained dark and quiet, and for a moment she thought about running, but curiosity held her in place. She approached the old house, the wood creaking under her weight. The door was ajar, swinging slightly in the wind. "Is anyone there?" she shouted, feeling a sense of foreboding creeping in. Suddenly, she heard footsteps behind her. She spun around to find the car empty. The door had swung open, and the driver was gone. Jessica's heart raced, and she felt a cold sweat form on her brow. "Maybe it's just a prank," she thought, trying to convince herself. But the sense of unease was overwhelming. She turned back to the house, her instincts screaming at her to leave. Then she heard it, a low growl emanating from the darkness. The sound sent chills down her spine. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she instinctively stepped back toward her car. Without thinking, she sprinted back to the vehicle, fumbling for her keys. Just as she reached the door, she glanced back toward the house. The driver was there, standing in the shadows, their face obscured by darkness. Jessica didn't hesitate. She jumped into the car, slammed the door shut, and locked it. Her heart raced as she started the engine, the sound roaring to life. As she looked in the rearview mirror, the figure stepped into the light. It was a woman, her eyes wide and unblinking, filled with a manic intensity. With a scream, Jessica threw the car into reverse and sped away, tires screeching against the gravel. The woman remained standing, watching as Jessica fled, her expression frozen in a terrifying smile. As she drove down the winding road, Jessica glanced back, but the woman had vanished. The headlights behind her had disappeared into the night, leaving only the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Finally reaching a main road, she let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. The adrenaline coursed through her. and she fought to steady her shaking hands. She would never drive that stretch of road again.